let's look at texture and some different ways that we can create it inside of Corel Painter 12. So in this example here, I have this moon or this planet here. It's got all kinds of craters. It looks like it's made out of rock. It's got all kinds of different colors going on, and there's a canvas texture over everything, and the background even has some stars. I created all of this, pretty much everything except for the circle, of course, with paper textures and different kinds of texture effects using brushes. So I'm going to show you all the different ways that I like to use textures. These are all on, they're in each component of this texture or of this painting are on different layers. So if I hide some of these layers temporarily, you can see that the stars are on their own layer, the moon's on its own layer, then the shading texture, then the light texture, then the paper texture, and so on. So it's all kind of built up. The reason why these are separate from each other is because I may want to tweak them independently or make subtle changes to each of these components rather than just do it all on one layer. If you do it all on one layer, there's a good chance that you might mess something up and then you'll have to start over, or it'll just take you a lot longer to do some things. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna go ahead and just close this, and we'll make a new canvas that is 72 dpi. You'll want to set this first, and then set your width to 14 and your height to 11 inches. And we'll go to OK here, using the space bar on my keyboard to pan my page around, and I might use tab now and then to make my palettes go away. Let's fill our background with black using the paint bucket. Make sure that your fill is set to current color, and then just tap to fill with black. Let's make a new layer, and we'll call this moon. So this is going to be our just basic shape here. Underneath the rectangle selection tool, if you tap and you hold, there's a elliptical marquee selection tool, and if you tap and you drag, you can make an elliptical shape. If you hold shift while you're tapping and dragging, you'll constrain your shape to a perfect circle, and if you hold alt with shift while tapping and dragging, then you can make your circle expand from the center. So that's how I prefer to do it, is tap and drag and hold shift and alt together. No, so I'm going to do my circle here in the center somewhere. Probably about this big. I'll reposition it a little bit to about there. Now we can fill this using the paint bucket, and we'll go ahead and fill it with a color kind of like this, kind of purplish blue-gray, something like that will work. I'm going to do a Control D on my keyboard to deselect that selection. And I think I'm going to use the layer adjuster here, this arrow tool, to maybe move my moon a little bit more. I think I want it right there. So we're going to do some basic shading on this moon, and then everything else, all the textures and colors and everything, we'll put on independent layers. So we'll turn on preserve transparency so that we can't paint outside of this shape. I'll show you real quick what I mean by that. I can only paint inside this shape while it's turned on, and while preserve transparency is turned off, I can paint anywhere. So we want it to be on. We want to use the digital airbrush. We're going to sample this base color here, and let's make it a darker color here by going down in value, and then we'll also shift our hue towards purple a little bit. We'll go through and we'll shade the left and the bottom side, because our light's going to be coming from the top right. Something like that. Put some highlights on it by shifting our color brighter. I want something like this, maybe a light gray, and we'll add a highlight on it over here. We can also sample one of these kind of medium colors here, and we can go along the edges, and using the edge of the brush to paint, we can paint in some edge highlights here to kind of make it stand out more. I think it needs a little bit more shadow, so I'm going to sample this background color here, and there we go. I want it to kind of almost blend into the background a little more. think that's better. We'll put in a little bit more of this edge highlight here. Now it really pops out. Alright, looking good. Now, this is your kind of basic texture. It's like no texture at all, or very little texture, so it looks smooth. And if we blend it, of course, we can make it even smoother. So this could be like plastic or metal or something. You know, just a really smooth texture with no chips taken out of it, you know, just something nice and soft. Now if we want to add texture to this, hard texture or coarse texture, we can select the diffuse blur, select the coarse oily blender brush, and we'll use kind of a smaller brush here. Now when you're blending, what we want to do is we want to mix up this shading a little bit, but we don't really want to take the dark into the light or the light into the dark. We want to keep everything kind of in its own area, so I'm kind of tapping and doing short strokes here to add some texture. Something like this. And be careful not to blend from the outside of your shape in, because if you do, you're going to pull in white. So blend from the inside out like that. And there we go, we have some texture. So that's one way to add texture. Now another way that we can add texture is we can put some texture on a new layer. So let's select the outline of this shape here by right-clicking on the layer and choosing Select Layer Content. Now I'm going to do Control-Shift-H on my keyboard to hide that selection. Turn off Preserve Transparency and make a new layer. Now this selection will still be here on this new layer, and it'll allow us to paint inside of that selection. We'll set the blend mode to multiply, and let's call it text here. So this will be another type of texture we can add. Use the sponge tool here. Under the sponges category, I believe I started with a loaded wet sponge, and I made some adjustments to it. But any sponge will work for this. And we'll take a darker color, something like this, and we'll take a pretty big brush size, and we can put in some sponge texture. You can change the size of your brush to make finer texture wherever you want. You can make it really big to add large texture. And then if you want to adjust this layer now, since it's on its own, you can take down the opacity, make it blend a little better. So that's another way to add texture. Another way we can do it is we can have some tinting that'll add texture. We'll also make that a multiply blend mode. We can take something like orange brown here, and we'll use the square chalk for that. And let's change our paper texture to artist rough paper. We'll put our scale and contrast all the way up. And we'll reduce our scale and texture a little bit, or contrast a little bit, and throw in some smaller shapes. So there's some dark area. Again, we could change the opacity of that a little bit. And then if we want to create some elevated areas, we can do some light texture. So let's duplicate this layer that we just created, and let's call it light. Let's set the blend mode to screen, and let's go ahead and move it below the tint layer. Then we'll use our layer adjuster tool to move it up and to the left a little bit. That'll kind of make it look like there's some elevated edge here. and we don't want that to be everywhere. So what we can do is we can subdue it in a few spots by turning on preserve transparency. Then if we paint on a screen layer with black, it's going to conceal what was on that layer. So we want to do it especially on the darker side. And just kind of do it in a few places here and there. And again, we can play with the opacity of this layer to get it looking how we want, something like that. On this tint layer here, we can also add in some darker areas here and there to kind of change it up. Looks pretty good. If we want to add some color variation, again, we can add another layer, and we can call that color. Turn off preserve transparency, make it a multiply blend mode. Let's just take some weird color here and add some of this in, and let's change our paper texture also. I'm going to post a link in the description of some of these other textures you can get. They're Corel Painter's extra content. And one of the really good ones is Bumpy Elephant Skin. Looks a lot like craters. Let's see, it works pretty well. And change the texture and contrast and pick another color. Some orange like this. And there we go. Now we've got some different colored things growing on our planet here. We can change the opacity of that to kind of make it blend in better. There you go. You can see we have all kinds of texture going on now. Kind of looks like a petri dish more than a planet. So we're going to tweak it a little more to make it look more like a planet. So let's add a new layer. And let's call it HL for highlights. And we'll take a light gray color. And let's pick a different paper texture. Let's try something else like this Polypay wool. Let's see what this does. We can add some, maybe this is like snow or something on the planet now. And let's make a new layer. Let's do a selection of this highlight layer by right-clicking on it, and we'll hide the selection with Control-Shift-H. We'll go back to this new layer we made, and we'll call it HLSH for highlight shadow. I know that might be kind of confusing. That's just what I feel like calling it. Set the blend mode to multiply. Sample this kind of dark purple color here, and we'll use a digital airbrush to go through and tint some of this. We can even take the black from the background color and go through and darken it even more. Not too much, you want it to blend in naturally. Might have to put back in a little bit of the highlight over here to make it look correct. Get something like that. If we want to add some texture over that too, we could use the sponge again. Put a little bit of subtle texture on it there. So there you go. There's a pretty interesting looking planet. If we want to now put some stars in the background, normally this isn't the way I would make stars, but since I kind of want to show you demonstrations on how to make texture, I'm just going to do it this way. So I'm going to make a new layer and call it stars. And we can use something like maybe sandy pastel paper. Let's try these settings here and see if this is going to work. So I'm going to use my square chalk brush. I'm going to use, oops, we need to deselect our selection here. which is still active, you can see. So I'm going to deselect with Control D on my keyboard. Now I can paint. Let's see, we want our settings maybe more like this. So I'm pushing down really lightly. Oh, let's try a different paper. That one's not working too well. Let's try this bumpy elephant skin. This is actually what works better. I didn't want you to have to go through the trouble of downloading it first, but you'll see how well it works. So these could maybe be stars in the background here. I don't know that there's another brush you could use that works this well, so maybe this is the one you're going to have to get. But there you go, that gives you an idea of how you can put some stars in the background. Now there's a final kind of texture you can apply to the whole canvas, and that makes your canvas look like it's made out of a certain kind of paper or a certain kind of material. So that could be canvas or watercolor paper or something. What you want to do is, there's two ways you could do it. One is you could flatten your whole image, but you don't really need to do that. There's no reason to flatten all your layers. You can do this kind of magic trick where you can put your texture on its own layer. So what we do is we create a new layer and we call it canvas. This will be our canvas texture. And what we want to do is we want to pick a medium gray, so something right in the middle here. Okay. And then we're going to use the paint bucket to just fill the screen with that gray color. Now, if we set the composite method or the blend mode to overlay, it's not going to really change it too much. Dimmed it a little bit, but that's okay. Maybe we need to go a little bit brighter with our setting there. There we go. Now if we apply a texture to this gray color here that's on its own layer, the light and the dark are going to show through to the layers beneath it. So let's see how this works. Let's do apply surface texture. Now it's going to apply the texture based on the paper you have selected, so maybe we should change that first. Let's pick gessoed canvas, and these settings also affect your paper texture. So we'll go to effects, apply surface texture. It's going to apply this texture here that you can see to everything. You can adjust it to make it less sharp if you want, and you can change the light direction too if you want. Let's just go with this for now, and we'll click OK and see what happens. And then apply the texture to the whole canvas. That texture is on its own layer, so you can see as long as the blend mode's set to multiply and that layer is filled with the right gray color, which is kind of a medium gray, that canvas is just automatically going to work. If we don't set it to overlay and we do normal, you can see this is what it looks like. And if we do multiply, it's too dark, and if we do screen, it's too light. So overlay is the magic setting here. Now we could take down the transparency of this layer to kind of blend it a little more. And I feel like if you just use one texture and you don't refine your texture at all, it looks kind of fake. Like it looks like you just applied a filter to your artwork. So we want it to look more convincing. Like we want people to look at it and go, okay, there's some texture there, but I can't tell if that's a real painting or a digital painting. So we need to change this up a little bit, this texture here. So one thing we can do is we can mask off some of it. I recommend maybe you save your file at this point, just to make sure that you don't lose any progress if something happens and Painter crashes. Let's add a mask here, and we'll click the new layer mask button. It adds a new mask. Make sure the mask is selected by tapping on it. And let's use the sponge here with black to paint in here and there. And what this is doing is it's erasing, if I set it back to normal, what it's doing is it's, wherever I'm putting this black, it's erasing from the canvas texture. So that way there'd be texture, but it won't all be the same everywhere, which is kind of how it would look if you did a real painting. So I'm going to set this back to overlay. And then let's add another layer of texture, a different kind of texture. So let's make a new layer, and Again, let's fill it with this medium gray color here. Use the paint bucket to fill the screen. Set the blend mode to overlay. Check to see if it's darkening it or lightening it by turning the eyeball on and off. If it looks like it's darkening it too much, just shift your gray up a little bit. You want to get it to look like it's not changing it at all by that overlay layer being there. Get a different kind of texture here. Let's go with thick handmade paper. Try something like this. Go to Effects, Apply Surface Texture. See what your texture looks like. That looks good. Okay, that's obviously way too much texture, so we can back it down a little bit by changing the layer opacity. And again, let's add a mask to that layer. And we'll use black with custom sponge brush to mask out some of that texture. We can zoom in and we can do a before and after and see. This is a paper texture. I'll just label this so you know what it is. So paper texture, that's after. This is before, after. You can see the same thing with the canvas texture. It's kind of subtle. That's how we want it to be. We don't want it to be really obvious. I think maybe the canvas texture still needs to be backed down a little bit more. You can especially see it right here, so we don't want it to be too sharp. So that's about it for texture. Those are all some different ways you can add the texture. If you're confused about these masks here and this preserve transparency and the blend modes, you can watch my video on alpha and I'll show you how to do all that stuff and what it all means. Thanks for watching.